There are pianists who can play every note correctly and somehow kill the music. The timing is clean, the notes are correct. If you graded the performance with a checklist, it would probably do very well. Then another pianist misses one note and somehow the piece is alive. You can probably feel the difference if you have listened to enough music. And I started wondering whether morality works the same way, whether getting every visible thing right can still mean missing what the whole thing is for. For a long time, I thought the opposite. I used to think, if you want to judge somebody fairly, just look at what they actually did. Do not rely too much on this vague thing called character, because I meant well is probably one of the oldest excuses in the world. A parent can control a child for 20 years and then say, I only did it because I loved you. So I thought, fine, forget intention, just look at the visible evidence. That felt more serious to me, more modern somehow, and I still think that corrected something real. But after a while, I started noticing that it created another kind of stupidity. What I had missed was that rules and evidence are supposed to help judgment. They cannot do the judging for you, and once judgment disappears, you can become extremely correct about individual things while completely misreading the person in front of you. Confucius has this interesting moment with his student Zai Yu. After being disappointed by him, Confucius basically says, I used to listen to what a man said and trust him. Now I listen, but I also watch how he acts. At first, that sounds very modern, like forget the words and just check what the person did. But I think I used to hear the word action too mechanically. I imagined an action as a finished object. He did X, therefore mark X on the moral scorecard. But I do not think watch how he acts means opening a spreadsheet and counting moral events. There is another line in the Analects where Confucius says basically observe what a person does, look at the path he takes, and see where he naturally settles. That is a person in motion. You are watching how he moves through life and what he keeps returning to, so the action matters, but not as a frozen result. It matters because it reveals the movement underneath it. That is much closer to what I mean when I say vibe. And yes, vibe is a dangerous word, because I do not mean random feeling you have about somebody. I mean a judgment about the pattern of a person that becomes clearer the longer you watch him. It can sound like, well, I like this person, so he must be good. I'm not saying that. Some people have a very strong presence, but it feels wrong, too frantic, too eager, almost feverish. You know the type, everything is intense, everything is urgent, intensity is not depth, and I do not think you can reduce a good vibe to a checklist, but that does not mean it is arbitrary. You can observe it, you just cannot mechanize it completely. You develop the ability to sense it while spending time with things that you have real depth, music, literature, art, and also their cheap imitations. Because judgment itself has a taste component, you are learning proportion when something is too much, too little, too frantic, too dead. Nobody can give you a definition that mechanically produces good taste. You encounter enough serious things, and eventually your judgment starts noticing differences that a definition cannot teach you to notice. Children sometimes seem to have more of this than adults. A child may distrust an adult before he has a clean argument for why. Obviously, children can be wrong. The point is not that the feeling is automatically true. The point is that perception can arrive before explanation. But adults often become strangely proud of losing this capacity. We start trusting whatever can be printed on paper, titles, credentials, achievements, and what we call that maturity. We become more educated about what can be written down and less educated about human presence, and then rules have to carry more and more of the moral weight. Now here is the obvious problem, but what if somebody initially seems well-oriented and still keeps producing bad results? Maybe you just keep forgiving him forever. No, that is not quite right. Sometimes the person is simply in the wrong position. A kind person can be a terrible manager. Being a good person does not mean you are good at every role. And confusing those two is another way outcome-based morality becomes crude. And I should be careful here, because if someone is actually suited to the role and genuinely learning, then the failures should start changing. I do not mean the mistakes suddenly disappear, but they should change. He should stop making exactly the same mistake for exactly the same reason. This is where the vibe has to cash out in reality. If the underlying direction is really good, you should eventually see some form of learning. If nothing changes for years, then maybe I misread him, or maybe he is simply not capable of carrying that role. And I also do not trust instant reflection as much as I used to. Sometimes somebody makes a mistake and immediately gives you the perfect apology. He can tell you exactly what went wrong and what he is supposed to learn. It sounds impressive, but maybe none of it has really gone inside it. Some people learned very early that when they make a mistake, the safest thing is to explain themselves quickly. Maybe they were punished harshly. Maybe they are terrified as being seen as bad. So immediate self-explanation does not automatically mean deep understanding. Real change is slower. I care less about the perfect apology right away. I care whether, months later, something in the way the person behaves is actually different. That is the difference between reading a moral statement and reading a person. This is also why bad outcomes do not automatically prove bad judgment. Imagine a pilot facing an emergency based on everything he can reasonably know at the moment. One landing option gives the passengers the best chance. He chooses it. Then something nobody could reasonably predict happens, and then the landing fails, and the result is terrible. But the horror of this outcome does not travel backwards in time and makes his original judgment immoral. Of course, if he ignored information he should have seen, then the judgment changes. Outcomes still matter, but sometimes things happen that nobody could reasonably know beforehand. A wise decision can fail, a stupid one can succeed, and if you judge only by the result, you start confusing luck with wisdom. And once you do that, you stop judging judgment itself. Confucius has another line that people today almost never expect from him. He talks about the kind of person who insists that every promise must be kept exactly as stated and every action carried through no matter what. And Confucius does not treat that as the highest moral type. That sounds strange because reliability seems obviously good, and of course promises matter, but imagine promising something and later discovering that keeping the promise would violate a much more serious duty. What happens if your morality has no way to rank obligations? You become rigid. The promise that was supposed to serve the good becomes more sacred than the good itself. That is the problem with rules. When we forget what rules are for, they are scaffolding for judgment, not a substitute for it. Jesus attacks something very similar in the Pharisees. He does not simply say, forget the rules. That would be too easy. In Matthew 23, he criticizes people who are extremely precise about small obligations while missing what he calls the weightier matters, justice, mercy, things like that. And importantly, he does not say the smaller duties should simply disappear either. That is part people sometimes miss. If you do not naturally love your brother today, a rule may at least stop you from treating him horribly. Doctrine can hold a boundary while the heart is still immature, but the rule is supposed to educate the heart, not replace it. At its best, doctrine protects you while your perception is still immature, but if the perception never matures, the doctrine becomes a cage you start mistaking for virtue. You can perform every correct duty and still become the kind of person nobody can breathe around. That is when correctness has stopped forming character and started replacing it. And I think this is why some technically perfect people feel deeply untrustworthy. They have a principle for almost everything. The problem appears when two of those principles collide, because then you need judgment, not just another rule. If you introduce context, they think you are compromising. You know what I mean, the person is technically right, but somehow impossible to live with. And because everything feels so morally clear to him, he can become cruel without even noticing the cruelty. His rules are functioning perfectly, his judgment is not. The person doing the damage may feel unusually righteous. This brings me back to music. In classical piano, there is something called rubato. Basically, the timing breathes. You do not destroy the rhythm. You let the phrase breathe. Sometimes it stretches, sometimes it comes back, but it still belongs to the whole movement. Moral judgment needs something like that, not because morality is vague, but because real situations have timing, proportion, and hierarchy. You should not live as if morality is a metronome going, okay, that duty is done, next one, next one, next one. But the opposite is also stupid. Rubato is not randomly hitting notes because you feel the music. The score still matters. Morality is not a list of correct notes. It is the cultivated ability to see the music alive without abandoning the score. The rules are the score. Judgment is the ability to hear what the score is trying to make possible. And once I started thinking of rules this way, law started to look different too. Lao Tzu has this change sequence where once the way is lost, people start talking about virtue, then more explicit moral forms appear, and eventually ritual. He was not describing modern law, but I think the intuition carries. When people lose confidence in their ability to judge character, they demand more explicit criteria. Then every ambiguity seems to need a new procedure. Every conflict needs to be defined more precisely. Law is necessary, especially when people do not know or trust each other, but law is the last line. It cannot do the whole moral job for us. A law can stop certain behavior. It cannot teach people how to sense what is right before the law has to intervene. That kind of perception has to be formed somewhere else. When character becomes unreadable, paperwork becomes a kind of moral prothesis. So how do you know whether someone's vibe is actually good? I do not think there is a checklist, because the moment I give you one, we recreate that exact problem. But that does not mean there is no evidence. The evidence is spread across time rather than compressed into one score. The way I see it now, you have to watch somebody across time. So when I say I'm reading the vibe, I'm actually looking for consequences that appear slowly. I look at what failure does to him. Does he feel more perceptive or just more defensive? Over years, do people around him become more capable of telling the truth around him, or do they become more careful and performative? I also want to know whether he is becoming less obsessed with status or just better at getting what he wants. A person can feel wonderful for 20 minutes and still have a terrible pattern over 20 years. And if he keeps failing at one particular task despite all of that, maybe he is not evil. Maybe he is simply in the wrong role. This is why I think the real test of vibe is not 20 minutes, it is 20 years. Think about the people you have actually known that long. Imagine one person who says imperfect things and occasionally makes decisions that go badly. But over time, something good keeps growing around him. People become more able to speak honestly. They do not have to shrink themselves around him. Then imagine another person who says everything correctly and almost never gives you obvious moral violation to point at. But people around him slowly become smaller, more anxious, more careful about performing the right thing. Nobody can point to the exact rule he broke. That is precisely why he is difficult to judge. Which one actually understood morality? If you have met somebody who was technically right but somehow made everyone around him worse, tell me what gave it away, and subscribe if you feel the vibe not as a moral obligation. I think I would have answered the question differently years ago. I would have counted the visible errors. I used to think rules were morality. Now I think rules are supposed to teach us how to perceive morality. Now I think character is closer to music. One wrong note can exist inside a living performance, and perfect notes can exist inside a dead one. The point is not to excuse the wrong note, it is to recover the ability to hear the piece.